Somewhere in a storage facility right now, there is a box. Inside that box, an evidence bag. Inside that bag, a fragment, a fiber, a hair, a drop of something long dried and forgotten. It has been sitting there for decades. The detective who worked the case has long since retired. The family has long since learned to live with the silence. The file has been opened and reopened and closed again more times than anyone can count. At some point, the world moved on. The case did not. But here is the thing about evidence. It does not age the way memory does. It does not grow tired or doubtful or afraid. A strand of DNA does not forget what it knows. A ballistics match does not change its mind. Sonar does not look away from the bottom of a river. The science that existed when these cases went cold, it wasn't enough. What exists now is a different matter entirely. Forensic genealogy, AI-assisted case analysis, sonar technology in the hands of a fisherman on a Sunday afternoon. These are not the tools of old investigations. These are the tools that reached back through decades of silence and pulled the truth out by its collar. These are 5 cases that the world gave up on. The world was wrong. Roy George Benn, September 25, 1967, Sartell, Minnesota. Roy George Benn was 59 years old, a widower, a businessman. He owned an appliance repair shop in St. Cloud and an apartment building he managed himself. He was, by every account, a man who had built something, quietly, without fuss, the way men of that generation often did. That morning, he sat down for breakfast at King's Supper Club off Highway 10. He was dressed well, a dark suit, a white French-cuffed shirt, gold and pearl cufflinks. He was reportedly carrying a substantial amount of cash. Some accounts say several $100s. Others put the figure as high as $5,000. He finished his meal. He walked out to the parking lot. He got into his metallic blue 1963 Buick Electra. And that was the last time anyone ever saw Roy Benn. Because he lived alone, nobody noticed right away. The first newspaper report of his disappearance didn't appear until 3 days later, September 28, 1967. Investigators chased leads. They searched quarries. They dug along roadsides. Roy's older brother, Walter, told reporters he suspected foul play. The man had cash on him. He had a business to run, an apartment building to manage. He had no reason to simply vanish. But nothing turned up. Not the car, not Roy, nothing. By 1968, Walter was auctioning off Roy's belongings just to cover the property taxes on the appliance shop. A mantel clock, some TV trays, a bird cage. In 1975, 8 years after he disappeared, Roy Benn was declared legally dead. The case didn't close, it just stopped. 50 years went by. The supper club where Roy had his last meal, gone. Most of the people who knew him, gone. The investigators who worked the case, retired or dead. Walter Benn, the brother who never stopped wondering, gone. 58 years, and not a single answer. August 10, 2025. A 22-year-old fisherman named Brody Locke was out on the Mississippi River near Riverside Avenue in Sartell, the same stretch of water that runs through the same town where Roy Benn had his last meal 58 years earlier. He was testing a new sonar fish finder, the kind of device that sends sound waves down through the water and maps whatever it finds at the bottom. Something appeared on his screen, an unusual shape, 24 feet below the surface, buried under decades of river sediment. I was skeptical at first, Locke later said. It looked like it could be a rock, but when we came around the other side, it just made that perfect vehicle cab and frame shape. He called the police. The Stearns Benton County Sheriff's Office dive team went into the water. They confirmed the find. 3 days later, Collins Brothers Towing pulled the vehicle from the river. It was intact, half filled with sediment, severely deteriorated after nearly 6 decades underwater, but intact. Investigators ran the VIN number. It matched a 1963 Buick Electra registered to Roy George Benn of Sauk Rapids, Minnesota. Inside the vehicle, human remains. Because the remains had been submerged for so long, they were fully skeletonized. Fingerprints were impossible. Dental records from the 1960s were almost certainly gone, so the Midwest Medical Examiner's Office extracted DNA from the bones, a painstaking process with no guarantee of success, and compared it against the sample taken years earlier from one of Roy's surviving relatives. On September 4, 2025, the match was confirmed. The remains were Roy Benn. The medical examiner's conclusion was not what Walter Benn had long feared. There was no sign of foul play. Roy Benn died as the result of a single motor vehicle crash. His car had gone off the road and into the river, in the dark, in the early hours of that September morning in 1967. He had not been robbed. He had not been murdered. He had simply, in the most ordinary and devastating way possible, driven into a river and never come back. For 58 years, his car sat at the bottom of the Mississippi, undisturbed, unseen, waiting. It took a 22-year-old with a fish finder to finally bring him home.
RHONDA Marie Fisher.
RHONDA Marie Fisher was 30 years old, a mother, a daughter, a sister. In the weeks before her death, she had been moving between places, staying with different acquaintances in the Denver area, navigating the kind of instability that rarely makes headlines but is lived quietly by more people than most would care to admit. On the night of March 31, 1987, she was last seen walking north on Monaco Street toward Leetsdale Drive in Denver, alone, at night. She never arrived wherever she was going. The following morning, April 1, 1987, a passing motorist noticed something off the side of South Perry Park Road in rural Douglas County, roughly 35 miles south of Denver. Down an embankment, a body. It was RHONDA Fisher. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. At the scene, investigators followed standard procedure. They documented everything. They collected everything. And over her hands, to preserve any trace evidence that might remain, they placed paper bags. It was a routine step, the kind of thing done at hundreds of crime scenes, the kind of detail that gets noted in a report and then largely forgotten. Nobody could have known in that moment that those paper bags would one day solve the case. Investigators had suspects from the beginning. One acquaintance RHONDA had been staying with was looked at closely and ultimately cleared. Beyond that, detectives cast their net wider, examining several known serial offenders who had been active in the Denver metro area throughout the 1970s and 80s. One name kept surfacing: Vincent Darrell Groves. Groves was already known to law enforcement. He had been convicted of murder in 1982 and released after serving fewer than 5 years. After his release, he continued operating in the Denver area, working as a janitorial supervisor with access to job sites across the city. His crimes primarily targeted vulnerable women. By the time RHONDA Fisher was found on that embankment, Groves had already left a trail of bodies. But suspicion is not evidence, and in 1987, the evidence wasn't there to make the connection stick. In 2017, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office submitted multiple items for fresh DNA testing, swabs, fingernail scrapings. The results yielded almost nothing. No usable profile. A trace of male DNA on one hand, too minimal to identify anyone. The case went cold again. RHONDA Fisher's parents died without answers. Her brother died without answers. The file sat.
In early 2025, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reopened the Fisher investigation. They went back through everything, every item, every bag, every swab. Working with forensic scientists from the Unified Forensic Lab, they began resubmitting evidence for testing, this time using capabilities that simply had not existed in 2017. And then someone made a decision that changed everything. They tested the paper bags, the ones placed over RHONDA's hands at the scene, the ones that had sat in an evidence locker for nearly 40 decades, the ones no one had thought to test before because they were just packaging, just procedure. In October 2025, the results came back from CODIS, the National DNA Database. A match. The DNA recovered from inside those paper bags matched biological evidence connected to 3 homicides committed in Denver in 1979. All 3 of those homicides have been linked to the same man, Vincent Darrell Groves.
Vincent Darrell Groves is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in Colorado history. Law enforcement believes he was responsible for at least 12 homicides and likely more. His victims were almost exclusively vulnerable women. He operated for over a decade, hiding in plain sight as a working man with legitimate job sites across Denver. He died in prison in 1996, serving time for 2 additional murders, never knowing, or perhaps never caring, that the evidence from at least one more of his crimes had been quietly waiting in a paper bag in a Douglas County evidence locker. He will never face a courtroom for what he did to RHONDA Fisher. But on December 2, 2025, Douglas County Sheriff Darren Weekly stood before cameras and said his name out loud and said RHONDA's name too. RHONDA Fisher was a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Her case exemplifies our dedication to bring closure to families who have endured unimaginable weights. The only living family member they were able to reach was a cousin. The cousin was, in the words of the investigator who called her, very happy to finally have some answers. 38 years, a paper bag, and technology that didn't exist when those hands were placed inside it. That is what it took.
The Middle Child. Bear Brook State Park. Bear Brook State Park sits in the forests of southern New Hampshire. Quiet trails, dense woods. The kind of place people go to disappear from the world for an afternoon. In November 1985, a hunter made a discovery deep in those woods that would haunt investigators for the next 40 years. A barrow, sealed, and inside it, the remains of 2 people. A woman, estimated to be in her 20s or 30s, and a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. They had no identification, no personal effect, nothing that connected them to any missing persons report anywhere in the country. They had simply been placed there, sealed inside a barrel, left in the woods to be forgotten. No one reported them missing. No one came looking. They were given temporary names by investigators, Marlise and the girl beside her, and the case went nowhere. In the year 2000, 15 years after the first discovery, investigators returned to the same area of Bear Brook State Park. They found a second barrel. Inside it, 2 more girls, both young, both unidentified, both left in the same remote stretch of woodland, sealed away from the world the same way the first 2 had been. 4 victims, 2 barrels, 1 location, decades apart in discovery, but almost certainly connected by the same hand. Who were they? Who put them there? How long had they been in those woods? For years, nothing. It took decades of forensic work, DNA genealogy, and cross-agency collaboration before investigators were able to piece together what had happened in those woods. The killer was eventually identified as Terry Rasmussen, a drifter, a manipulator, a man who moved through multiple states under multiple aliases, leaving a trail of missing women and children behind him. He had been convicted of an unrelated crime and died in a New Hampshire prison in 2010, never charged with the Bear Brook murders. By 2019, 3 of the 4 victims had been identified. The woman in the first barrel, Marlise Honeychurch, a young mother who had fallen into Rasmussen's orbit, the 2 girls beside her, and in the second barrel, her daughters, Sarah McWaters and Marie Vaughn, and another of Rasmussen's victims. 3 names, 3 families with something approaching closure. But the 4th victim, the young girl found with Marlise in that first barrel in 1985, remained nameless. Investigators called her the middle child. She was approximately 9 years old when she died, and for 40 years, that was all anyone knew about her. Think about what that means. A child, 9 years old, found in a sealed barrel in the woods of New Hampshire. No one reported her missing. No missing persons file matched her description. No school photograph anyone remembered. Investigators tried everything available to them. Forensic artists produced reconstructions of what she may have looked like. Her case was featured on television programs. Tips came in and led nowhere. She remained the middle child, a placeholder name given by people who refused to stop looking, because calling her nothing at all felt like doing to her in death what had already been done to her in life.
In 2025, a company called Firebird Forensics and the volunteer researchers at the DNA Doe Project took on the case. Working from hair samples recovered from the original scene 4 decades earlier, scientists were able to extract a viable DNA profile. That profile was run through genealogy databases, the same kind of crowdsourced ancestry records that had helped crack dozens of other cold cases in recent years. The analysis pointed to a biological connection to Terry Rasmussen himself. The middle child was not just one of his victims, she was his daughter. In September 2025, after 40 years, investigators announced her name, Rhea Rasmussen. She was 9 years old, the biological child of the man who killed her, found sealed in a barrel beside a woman who had likely tried to protect her. Left in the woods of New Hampshire in a year when Ronald Reagan was president and the Berlin Wall still stood. For 40 years, she had no name. Now she does. There is no family waiting for this news, no cousin who picked up the phone and exhaled with relief. Rhea Rasmussen's mother is almost certainly among the other victims. Her killer was her father. The only world she ever knew was the one he constructed around her. What DNA gave her was not justice. It was not closure. It was something smaller, and in its own way, more important. It gave her back her name. After 40 years in those woods and 40 years in the files of investigators who refused to stop asking, Rhea Rasmussen is no longer the middle child. She is known.
Estella, Mena. Every case in this video was solved by technology. DNA, sonar, genealogy databases, tools that didn't exist or didn't exist in their current form when these crimes were committed. But technology does not open old boxes on its own. It does not submit evidence for retesting on its own. It does not walk into a records room, pull a decades-old file, and decide, this one, this woman, not forgotten, not yet. Someone has to do that. In California for a long time, that someone was Detective Matt Hutchison. Estella Mena was 18 years old in 1979, a high school student in Sunnyvale, California, still in that in-between space, not quite done being a teenager, not yet fully whatever she was going to become. To help cover her expenses, she had taken a part-time job as a security guard. It was the kind of work that asks a lot from someone so young. Long shifts, empty buildings, the specific loneliness of being responsible for a space no one else cares about at that hour. One night, in the office building where she worked, someone found her. She had been stabbed. Her body was found in a corner of the building, next to a vending machine. She was 18 years old, and for more than 40 decades, no one was held accountable for what happened to her.
The investigation in 1979 went as far as it could go, which was not very far. There were no witnesses, no clear suspects. The physical evidence that existed sat in a property room and aged alongside the detectives who had worked the case and the family members who never stopped wondering. California has thousands of unsolved homicides from the 1970s and 1980s. The machinery of justice has limits. Cases compete for resources. The years accumulate, and without new leads, an 18-year-old girl stabbed in an office building in 1979 becomes a number in a database and a box on a shelf. That is, unless someone goes looking. Detective Matt Hutchinson had developed something of a reputation in California law enforcement circles, and not just among colleagues. ABC News would later describe his work in a headline that called him simply a badass detective. The description was earned. Hutchison had spent years doing the unglamorous, grinding work of cold case investigation, pulling old files, resubmitting old evidence, applying new forensic tools to old questions. He had made arrests in multiple cases that had been cold for decades. Families who had stopped expecting calls started receiving them. Estella Mena's case came onto his radar as part of a broader review of unsolved homicides in the Santa Clara County area. The case was old, the evidence was limited, the original investigation had done what it could. Hutchinson looked anyway. Among the evidence preserved from the 1979 crime scene was something that investigators at the time had collected but could not fully exploit. Blood found on Estella Mena's shoe. Not her blood. Blood that did not belong to the victim. In 2023, using modern forensic DNA analysis, Hutchison's team was able to extract a genetic profile from that sample. The profile was run through available databases, and it returned a match. The DNA pointed to a suspect who had been active in the California area during the late 1970s, a man who had, by the time the match came back, already been connected to at least one other cold case murder in the region. For Estella's family, who had spent 46 years without a name, without an arrest, without any public acknowledgement that the person responsible had ever been identified, the breakthrough represented something almost impossible to describe. A teenage girl had gone to work one night and never come home. Someone had finally gone back for her. The cases that Detective Hutchison worked, Estella Mena and others like her, share something in common that is worth saying out loud. They are cases involving women who were young, who were working, who were living lives that did not draw public attention when they were alive, and did not draw sufficient attention when they died. No documentary series was made about Estella Mena in the years after her murder. No true crime podcast kept her name in circulation. The machinery that sometimes resurfaces cold cases, public interest, media pressure, family resources, largely did not engage here. What brought her case to resolution was not public pressure. It was one detective and a bloodstain on a shoe that had been waiting in an evidence room for 46 years. Sometimes that is all it takes. Sometimes that is everything.
The Austin triple murder and the 4 wrongful convictions. Every case so far in this video has been about the same thing at its core. Someone was killed, someone was never held accountable, And decades later, through DNA, through sonar, through forensic genealogy, through a detective who refused to close a file, the truth finally surfaced. This last case is about all of that, but it is also about something else. It is about what happens when the system, the very system designed to find the truth, gets it catastrophically wrong and holds that wrongness in place for 30 years while 4 human beings pay the price for it. This is the case that should make you the most angry and the most relieved that it was finally cracked open. In 1991, 3 people were brutally murdered in Austin, Texas. The crime was violent, chaotic, and left investigators under enormous pressure to find answers fast. Fast answers and correct answers are not always the same thing. In the aftermath of the murders, several men were arrested and charged. The prosecutions moved forward, convictions were secured, and the system declared the matter closed. Justice served, perpetrators identified, case resolved. Except that the men who were convicted maintained from the beginning and without wavering that they had not committed the murders. They said it at trial, they said it in prison, they said it for years, and then for more years after that. No one with the power to change anything listened. Consider what 30 years inside a prison means when you are innocent. It means you watch your family age through glass. It means every appeal is another door that closes in your face. It means you learn the particular exhaustion of insisting on a truth that the people with power have already decided to disbelieve. It means you do not get those years back, ever, under any circumstances. The men convicted in connection with the 1991 Austin murders had maintained their innocence through all of it, through the years that turned into decades, through the legal motions that went nowhere, through a world outside that had largely moved on. The case had not moved on, because the real killer had never been named.
In 2025, investigators working a fresh review of the case submitted evidence for modern DNA and ballistic analysis. The results pointed, clearly, definitively, to a single individual, Robert Eugene Brashers. Brashers was not one of the men who had been convicted. He was not someone the original investigation had conclusively identified and prosecuted. He was a serial killer, a man whose pattern of violence stretched across multiple states and multiple years, the kind of offender whose crimes only become visible in full when the technology finally catches up to the scope of what he did. DNA connected him to the scene. Ballistic evidence connected him to the scene. The case that had sent 4 men to prison, the case that the system had declared closed for 30 years, had been built on the wrong foundation entirely. In late September 2025, Travis County District Attorney Jose Garza stood before cameras and said what 4 men had been saying for 3 decades. The overwhelming evidence points to the guilt of 1 man and the innocence of 4. The guilt of 1 man, the innocence of 4. Those 2 phrases contain within them the full weight of what modern forensic science can do, and the full cost of what happens when it arrives too late. Not too late to name the truth, but too late to give back what was taken. The years spent in prison do not unhappen. The milestones missed. The funerals attended in chains, or not attended at all. The children grown up without their fathers present. The lives built in the narrow space between concrete walls. None of that is restored by a press conference, however overdue. What the science gave these men was not their years back. It gave them their names back. And it named the man who should have been sitting in a cell all along.